Not a surprise. Not a surprise. All right, but I'm hopeful that we're going to finish Horayot tonight. It's a pretty short. Oh, there we go. It's a pretty short jump between where we are and where we need to be. And then the plan, for those of you who like to plan ahead, is that we will begin with Yoma on our next class. Yoma is the section that deals with Yom Kippur.
I love that.
Yeah, well, you know, it's going to have some parts that have a lot of history into it of what things were like and why they were like it during the days of the Second Temple. It's also going to have a lot of the rituals of the sacrifice and atonement, which can make a lot of what we read on Yom Kippur a lot clearer. And then it also, of course, covers issues like tshuva, of how one repents, of what we do on Yom Kippur. So it's a nice collection of different things.
But I like it, be allowed to snack during that time.
Yes, you will be allowed to eat while doing it. And it discusses fasting in particular on Yom Kippur. So there's all those details are also there. So, but Horayot, we need to finish. There's some interesting little twists in the last couple Mishnayot in chapter that we have to go to. We are on 2:7. Okay, almost there? Almost there. All right, and I think I've got a volunteer. Please.
The individual and the ruler are both obligated to bring an Asham Talui, but the anointed priest and the court are exempt.
All right, so remember, we talked before, this Asham Talui is if you're not sure whether you committed a transgression for which the punishment would be karet, and you bring it just in case. But we said before that if this was for an errant ruling, that they didn't do it. But the question now twists to, well, what happens if an individual ruler, a king, makes a mistake, not as making a ruling, but he himself does something, eats one of the pieces of the too fat, one of which he knows is forbidden. What happens? If you're a regular individual, you bring the Asham Talui. If you're a regular ruler, you bring the Asham Talui. If you are a priest, or if you are a court, you do not. Right? They are not treated as individuals. They are treated as institutions, and therefore they do not bring the individual sacrifice in that case.
And is this for transgression that they committed willingly, or that they accidentally did? Accidentally ate the wrong kind of meat.
Well, it's always accidental. There's a whole different set of tshuvot when you deliberately break a commandment.
Okay, so this is I didn't mean to. Look what I just did.
This is always the whoops case. Yes.
That makes sense.
And part 2?
The individual and the ruler and the anointed priest are obligated to bring an Asham Vadai, but the court is exempt.
So an Asham Vadai, if you look up at the introduction paragraph, there were 4 or 5 different situations when you had to bring an Asham Vadai, a particular type of guilt offering. If it was robbery, illegal use of sacred property, relations with a betrothed slave woman, a Nazir, or a leper. In different points, each of those categories would have to bring a particular type of guilt offering, an Asham Vadai. And if you were an individual and you fell into one of those categories, you would. If you were ruler, you would. And if you were even the high priest, you would. So the issue here is just that the court, as a collective institution, doesn't bring one of these sacrifices. So it's drawing the lines. It's like a really, really complicated Venn diagram of which overlaps with which in which circumstances. But the thing that you can notice most is that a court, under no circumstance, gets treated like an individual. The high priest gets a little bit like an individual and a little bit like an institution. And the king and the ruler, they're always treated as individuals for individual transgressions. For errant rulings, the king gets special treatment, but that's because it's a ruling, not a particular transgression. Follow the logic? Yeah.
I'm curious what happened in David's situation that he slept with, a married woman. What? That was but that wasn't something that he slipped and did it.
Well, it wasn't exactly a whoops, but I will point out, just as an aside, because it's a very, very rich text, but I will point out as an aside that according to the rabbinic understanding of that text, in the end, he didn't commit a transgression, right? So what they said was that at the time that this happened, and indeed this is something that was common long after the Davidic period as well, is if somebody was about to go to war, they would give their wife a get that said, if I die in the war, you are divorced from the day I left.
That's a big technicality.
So when Uriah dies, technically it retroactively divorced Bathsheba from the time before she was with David.
Wow.
Therefore, technically it wasn't adultery. Now, he is still blasted by the prophet. He is still blasted by God for what he did. But as far as actually committing a transgression for which he would be liable, he, because of the unique set of circumstances that were there, he just goes under the bar, at least according to the rabbinic interpretation. Now, like I said, he's not getting off the hook for being a good person for what he did. But as far as being an adulterer, thanks to retroactive circumstances, it turns out that he wasn't when he was. So retroactivity is a very powerful concept.
Wow, thank you for explaining that.
It's a good question, and one that really deserves more detail and discussion of the actual story. That chapter is an amazing tale with many different points that need to be made, but not tonight. All right, part three.
For the hearing of the voice of adjuration, for an oath made by an expression, or for impurity relating to the temple and its holy things, the court is not obligated, but the individual, the ruler, and the anointed priest are obligated.
Right, as we've now discovered this general pattern, except
that the anointed priest is not liable for impurity relating to the temple and its holy things. These are the words of Rabbi Shimon. What do they bring? A sliding scale sacrifice. Rabbi Eliezer says, the ruler brings a goat.
Right. And this is the debate we've had before of whether or not the ruler is obligated for a particular sacrifice or whether he is obligated just as an individual, which would be a sliding scale. So that's the debate at that point. Okay, now we get into chapter 3. And it gets a little complicated to start, and then we're going to get into some even more controversial topics. So let's deal with a timeline issue here. So in order to understand this, we're going to have to put on the timeline a number of different points.
Nice
So,
marker.
Yeah. Nice and clear marker, right? So if we have somebody who transgressed, right, and then they step down, do they bring a sacrifice? Right? Between the transgression and the sacrifice, their position changes, their status changes. What happens vis-a-vis their sacrifice? You can see the underlying question here is, if I am the high priest and I make this mistake, and then I'm no longer the high priest, do I still bring the high priest's sacrifice for the mistake I made while I was high priest? Or, because I'm no longer the high priest, am I no longer able to bring the sacrifice? Remember, don't always look to see whether this is getting away with something or it's a loophole. It's just a question of, is it applicable or not applicable? It's not that you're getting off. It's just, it doesn't apply anymore. That's the question we have. Good?
Yeah.
All right, let's see how the Mishnah handles it.
So in Mishnah 1, if an anointed priest transgressed and afterwards relinquished his high priesthood, and similarly, if a ruler transgressed and afterwards relinquished his reign, the anointed priest brings a bullock and the ruler brings a he-goat.
All right. So the basic idea is, if you step down, if you abdicate, because of the transgression you committed while you were in that office, the transgression is still resolved with the appropriate sacrifice as though you were in that high office, right? Because that's what triggered the event. That's what triggers the obligation. Therefore, the obligation is still hanging, even if you have even if you no longer have that office. Make sense?
Is that sacrifice is normal sacrifice?
It's the ones we've been
Yeah.
it's the ones we've been talking about for an errant ruling, right? Let's imagine you make a
the
mistake.
high priest would ordinarily bring.
Right, I make a
He may not be high
mistake.
priest, but it's still a high priest.
I make a mistake. Right, I make a mistake, and I'm still the high priest. I bring the sacrifice for my mistake. I make a mistake. I'm stepped down from the high priest, I still bring the sacrifice for when I was high priest. Now, we can apply this as a different type of mistake to a modern ruler. If somebody is a judge or a politician and they take a bribe, and then they either are voted out of office or they step down from the bench, and then people discover that they had taken a bribe while they were in office, do we prosecute them as when they were a judge taking a bribe, or do we say, well, you're no longer a judge, so it's not a crime anymore, right? Because people can give people money, that's not a problem, and you're no longer a judge. No, we would all agree that the status you had when you did the mistake is the status that needs to be answered by justice, or in this case, by sacrifice. So that concept is fairly intuitive when we think about a modern. Again, not comparable, because we're not expecting that the court or the priest or the king was taking a bribe to make the wrong ruling. But the idea that the standing you had when you made the mistake can really matter, even if you no longer have that position. But now let's make it more complicated.
Okay. If the anointed priest relinquished his high priesthood and afterwards transgressed, and similarly, if a ruler relinquished his reign and afterwards transgressed, the anointed priest brings a bull, while the ruler is like a regular person.
Okay, so I used to be king, and then I abdicated, and now my son, my daughter, whoever is king, and then I go out and I transgress. Do I bring the kingly offering, or do I bring just the regular Joe Schmo offering?
Joe Schmo makes sense.
If I'm king, I bring the Joe Schmo offering. I used to be the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. And then I step down in favor of another Kohen Gadol, and then I commit this transgression. Do I bring Joe Schmo sacrifice, or do I bring Kohen Gadol sacrifice?
But this says no. Right, but this says no.
But this says no, we bring a Kohen Gadol sacrifice. Why? Because a Kohen Gadol can never be reduced in his holiness. Even if he is no longer the Kohen Gadol, he is Kohen Gadol emeritus, if you will. And that status still matters. Even more so, right? Even more so. It's I was.
It's like I expect the rabbi, even if he steps down as rabbi, I still expect him to be at that high level.
One would expect, like a rabbi emeritus, but even more than that. I mean, the holiness attached to a Kohen Gadol was a different type of holiness than attaches to anything else in the world, any other person in the world.
Right, we don't have that anymore.
We don't. And so it's hard to come. I was really racking my brains as I was preparing for today to come up with an example of that. And basically I can't. I can come up with examples where we would still hold a person to a high standard because of their previous standard, but nothing that would actually legally put them in a unique position, where even though they're not doing the job, they're still counted like doing the job. We just don't have that concept in the modern world. Or if we do, I haven't figured it out, and let me know, and I'd love the example for the next time I try to teach this. But that's the standing at that point.
I think the way you said it is.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Okay, now we're going to change the situation again.
Okay. If they transgressed before they were appointed, and afterwards they were appointed, they are regarded as regular people.
Transgress, appointed.
Appointed to what in that?
Their office. So you know you're the prince, and you commit a transgression, and then you become king before you bring the sacrifice.
You're talking about
Kohen Gadol too.
Oh, okay.
Right? You're just a regular Kohen, Mr. Kohen, and you just work at the temple, and that's what you do, and then you get appointed to be Kohen Gadol. But before your appointment, you committed this transgression. Well, when it's time to bring the sacrifice, do you bring the sacrifice as Kohen Gadol and according to the rules of the Kohen Gadol, or do you bring the sacrifice according to Joe Schmo rules because you were Joe Schmo when you did it?
It looks like it's Joe Schmo.
Exactly right. Right. Both king and high priest bring from the condition they were in when they were committing the transgression. Right? If you were when you did it, then you are when you bring the sacrifice. And that works for up and down. The only exception was the Kohen Gadol doesn't get to come down. Right? He stays with a level of sanctity that cannot be erased.
But Rabbi Shimon said, if their sin came to their knowledge before they were appointed, they are liable. But if it's after they were appointed, They are exempt.
Right. So
Yeah.
Rabbi Shimon tries to play a little line and say, no, 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 no. If you knew about it beforehand, then yes, your sacrifice should be appropriate. But if you didn't know about it beforehand, then it became attached to you in your new status rather than your old status. It's almost like knowledge of the crime was necessary for it to become affixed. And he has certainly an emotional point. I mean, a gut point. If somebody was running for office, again, that's just the most common thing we have these days. And while they're running for office, nobody knows anything bad about them. And when they come into office, you find out that they embezzled money from their company 5 years before. It's going to feel like the elected official embezzled money. It's going to feel that way because it wasn't attached to them when they were Joe Schmo candidate. And it's going to seem like Senator so-and-so embezzled money. Even though it's actually, he wasn't senator when he did it. He was Joe Schmo when he did. And it's going to be hard for us to separate that feeling. But he's in the minority. The majority say, no, he was Joe Schmo. Even if he didn't know that he had done it wrong or whatever, then he was Joe Schmo. My apologies to all the Joe Schmoes.
Yes. Point 2. Who is meant by a ruler?
Now, this is an important thing because we've been handling this all in English, but the word that's used throughout this passage is nasi. And nasi is a little ambiguous because nasi is the term that's used in Leviticus, and nasi is the term that's used in a lot of Jewish texts for a leader. And the question is, when you say nasi, do you mean just anybody who's the leader of the community, or do you mean something special?
So, meant by a ruler, a king.
Right, a melech, right? We're not talking about just any group or any leader, person, synagogue president. We're talking about a melech. You have to be a king for all of these rules to apply.
And because it says, any of all the commandments of the Lord his God. That's in Leviticus.
They're talking about the nasi that's under investigation.
And a ruler or a king who has none above him save the Lord his God.
Right, so because of the unique phrasing of the Lord his God, right, rather than the Lord our God, because, I mean, God is the God of everybody, but by saying the Lord of the ruler, the ruler's God, we are basically reminding ourselves that for the ruler, there is no one above him except God. Whereas everyone beneath a melech, even a nasi that might be the head of a tribe or the head of a town, there's still somebody above him, at the very least, the king. So the only person for whom his God is the ceiling is the actual king. Therefore, when we read this, we have to be thinking about the king, not just a local powerful person. Make sense on how the rabbis are reading that? All right. We're just flying along. Okay. Now, in case you're wondering about this whole appointed priest thing, we're going to get a little bit more detail.
Okay, point 1, who is the anointed priest? He who is anointed with the anointing oil, and not he that has more garments.
All right, a little bit of history, right? Back in the day, that is to say at the beginning of the Mishkan, at the time of Aaron, at the time of the first high priest, and so on, when you became a high priest, you had your regular 4 garments that were worn by the Kohanim, and you gained, my son's been picked up, and you gained an additional 4 garments of the status of being the Kohen Gadol. Right? So you were dressed better, if you will. And you were anointed with oil. There was a particular special recipe of anointing oil that was used to mark the high priest as the high priest. What this is trying to tell us is that you may have the clothes, but if you don't have the oil, then in this one respect, you are not the Kohen Gadol. And that matters because after the time of King Josiah, we didn't have the oil. And that meant that all during the Second Temple period and much of the First Temple period, the Kohen Gadol was not fully anointed. Right? So they still did all the other jobs, and we're going to talk about that in just a second, but they didn't quite have the same standing as the Kohanim that came before them. Make sense? We'll talk about that different standing in just a minute, but that's what we're talking about. You have the oil and you have the clothes, and the clothes don't quite maketh the man.
And point 2, the only difference between a high priest who is anointed with the anointing oil and one who has more garments.
Right, which is the earlier high priests and the later high priests,
is the bull that is offered for the unwitting transgression of any of the commandments.
Right, so that's what we've been talking about. This whole section of Horayot, when you make those mistaken transgressions, you have to bring a bull if you're an oily priest. If you're not an oily priest, then you don't. But everything else that the priest does, you do. Right? So early high priest, later high priest, everything is the same except for this one particular category. Onward.
And the only difference between the acting high priest and the former high priest,
that's the Kohen Gadol Emeritus, right? So we now have the current guy and the guy who retired. But remember, we said the guy who retired, he steps down, but he doesn't go down in holiness. So what's the difference between them? Here's the difference.
the bull on the Day of Atonement and the 10th part of the ephah.
Right. So the current high priest is the one who actually does the Yom Kippur sacrifice in the Avodah service, which if you come on Yom Kippur, you'll hear us recite every time. And that you had to be the current high priest. No emeritus was allowed to do that. And also the ephah, which was the unique sacrifice of the high priest, also had to be done by the current high priest, not the emeritus. But everything else, a high priest still carried on with other things, which is going to be mentioned in part 4.
They are both equal in the service of the Day of Atonement,
Meaning the rest of the Yom Kippur service.
and both are commanded to marry a virgin and are forbidden to marry a widow. They are both forbidden to become impure for their relatives.
Meaning when they die.
They do not let their hair grow long, nor do they rend their clothes.
By the way, those are signs of mourning, not just a ponytail, right? Letting your hair grow long means you
That's
are
right.
not shaving, not cutting, because you are grieving.
And they return the accidental killer from the city of refuge.
When they die. That's the unspoken part there. So you may remember that there were these cities that when somebody had accidentally killed, they could seek refuge there so that the family wouldn't hunt them down and kill them. And the only way that you would be released from those cities was when the high priest died.
Oh.
Right? So the question became,
That's right.
well, if the high priest emeritus dies or if the high priest current dies? And the answer is either. Right? So if any one of the high priests, current or former, that are still alive passes away, then those who are in the city are released. Make sense?
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm learning a lot today.
Yeah.
Well, we don't talk an awful lot about the Kohanim and the high priest. We're going to talk more tonight. So the high priest had very unique status in the community. And you may remember from dealing with regular Kohanim status that a regular Kohen doesn't go to the cemetery or do other signs of mourning for distant relatives or friends. It's in order to maintain their ritual purity, they have to be removed from places where the dead body is. A high priest couldn't go even for their mother, even for their father, even for their immediate family, right? They were not allowed to go at all, ever. So that was a step above. So that is what is being described in those other mourning rites that are being discussed. We have no high priest at the moment, so don't worry, no one person has to carry that responsibility in the modern world.
A high priest rends his clothes from below, and an ordinary priest from above.
Okay, so, right.
I thought they weren't rending their clothes, they weren't supposed to.
Okay, so
Yeah, but
what about the rending? Well,
Yeah.
the Torah says not to rend, but the rabbis from the context don't think that means don't rend at all. They take that to mean don't rend the way people rend. Where do we rend? We rend here if it's for a father or mother, and we rend over here for anyone else that we are mourning for, that immediate circle, right? Father, mother, brother, sister, spouse, or children. Those are the people that we tear for, right? Just think of it as like your family tree circle, right? If they're parents, if they're your siblings or spouse, or if they're your children, then that's when we tear. And the answer here is yes, they don't tear up here, but at the bottom of their garment, they do tear, so that they do have some sign of rending, but it's not as in such a obvious place.
is it because the garments were holy? It sounds like I'm just wearing your regular clothes.
Right. It's also a sign of disruption. Right. Mourning and grieving was very disruptive to the spiritual person, as it still remains. And we needed to ensure that the high priest was prepared always to do their duties, and even the regular priests had to be prepared. And so those signs, outward signs of mourning, were diminished. But of course, they're still grieving, and therefore there had to be some token of acknowledgement for that. And then part 2.
A high priest offers sacrifices while an onen, but does not eat them. And an ordinary priest neither offers sacrifices nor eats them.
Okay, so onen is first the category we have to explain. So between, I've actually got a timeline here, between the moment someone dies and the moment the person is buried, the mourners are called an onen, right? I'm an onen between the death and the funeral, because it's a period of shock, of raw grief, if you will, not the Shiva grief where your tears are actually flowing and you're really feeling the pain, but it's just you are stupefied during that period.
During that period, I also understand that between the person dies and the very, we don't pray either. We don't go to services, and I can see why, because you're in such shock. Because I know when my mother died, I went straight to shul because they were having minyan. I didn't know where else to be. David was waiting for the person to come, to pick her up. So he waited, and I realized I could not pray. You're not in the same condition.
We are exempt from the positive commandments during that time period.
That's right.
Right.
Yes.
So you're not failing to do the Shema. You're not supposed to be doing the Shema, because of how can you when your loved one is still unburied? They're still waiting for burial, and you're delaying this by doing something else. So onen, which again in the ancient world and even up in the modern world and still also in Israel, wasn't long. We're not talking about weeks here. We're talking about a matter of hours or maybe a day, overnight kind of thing. It's gotten a little stretched in the modern world for a whole variety of reasons, but it's still, in Judaism, we try to keep that period as narrow as possible, because grief really doesn't begin, the mourning process, until after the funeral. It's very important to have that taken care of. So in this category, which was a lot of preamble, if you are the high priest, you don't get to take time off for the sacrifices, because remember, you weren't going to their funeral. You're not allowed to ritually defile yourself for them, so of course you are still fit to do the sacrifice. But because of your status, because of your grief, you're not going to be eating the sacrifice. So you still perform it, but you don't get to enjoy it, if you will. Whereas a regular priest doesn't offer the sacrifice, and then of course doesn't eat from them either. Okay. 3:6.
Whatever is more frequent than another takes precedence over that other.
All right, so this is a general rule of thumb, and not just applicable for sacrifices and other issues, but is applicable for prayers and ritual activities in modern Judaism. So for example, I have my talit, I have my tefillin. Which do I put on first?
Talit.
The talit. Why? You do it every day. Whereas tefillin, you only do 6 days a week, right? Because the talit is more common, the talit comes first. The psalm for the day, the psalm for Rosh Chodesh. Which do I do first?
That's what we do the psalm for the day.
We do the psalm for the day, because Mondays come around more often than the new month comes around, right? So things that are, and that goes through and lots of other places as well, things that are more common, we do first. And then things that are less common, we do second, which is really a great philosophical teaching, that we shouldn't race after the new and the special and the novel, that we also have to embrace, appreciate, and do that which is routine and commonplace. That needs to be held on to just as passionately. But if you can't tell the difference between frequency, part 2 can help.
Whatever is more sacred than another takes precedence over that other.
All right, so for example, Kohen Gadol, he is top of the totem pole in terms of holiness, and therefore he gets special status and special treatment. And then part 3 will give us a little bit of an application.
If the bull of the anointed priest and the bull of the congregation are standing to be sacrificed, the bull of the anointed priest precedes that of the congregation in all its details.
Right? No offense, but the Kohen Gadol has a different status. And therefore, his sacrifice is going to be first on the block before the congregational sacrifice. Good way to solve arguments? Okay, because when you make orders of what takes priority over what, that removes all the arguments. Yeah, let's take a look at 3:7.
Okay.
People ready to get twitchy? Uncomfortable with the past?
Uh-oh. A man takes precedence over a woman in matters concerning the saving of life and the restoration of lost property. And a woman takes precedence over a man in respect of clothing and ransom from captivity. When both are exposed to degradation in their captivity,
Meaning rape?
the man takes precedence over the woman.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here.
This is a lot.
Yeah, this is a lot.
We're not talking about today's times, we're talking about the past, so.
Yeah.
you know.
Well, hold on. Let's make sure about that before we just jump to a comfortable conclusion. As I like to say, you've got to live with the discomfort
Yes.
before you can find resolution, or else you're not doing it right. You can't just say, oh, that doesn't apply. How do you know it doesn't apply today? Right? So I know we have this instinct of the Titanic is going down, women and children first in the lifeboats, right? Well, what's the Torah? What's the Mishnah saying here? No, you put the men in the lifeboat first. Pardon? Now, why is that more deeply offensive to you? Because I can tell by your faces, you're not terribly happy with that sentence.
Yeah.
Than the phrase, the women should go in the lifeboat and the men should drown.
I don't like either one, actually.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's the question. Why is saying that they should be saved versus them should be saved? Why are we comfortable with the women and children first statement, but we're uncomfortable with, if we're saving lives here, we should be saving the man. If we only have one lifesaver and there's two people drowning and one's a man, one's a woman, I'm throwing the ring to him. Why are we uncomfortable with that rather than saying I'm throwing it always to the woman? Right? Because we have been culturally
Yes.
shaped to believe that that is a value we should be following. And there's lots of very good sociological reasons of why that develops. Although I will point out that historically, all the way up into the modern world, women and children are almost always disproportionately the victims of violence, especially in life and death situations. You know, in the Titanic, those boats were not full of women and children. There were lots of men in those boats. It was not only women and children who were floating off of that boat in the limited lifeboats that they had. And when you look at villages that are hit by famine, you look at villages where you have wars and people are now refugees, the men are almost always in a higher proportion of the survivors than the women and the children. And of course, the elderly are first under the bus. So we may have these aphorisms of women and children first in the modern world, and they may make us somehow feel good, but in practice, they have not always been held to very perfectly. Now, let's, instead of wondering about which one is better or worse, let's try and figure out why the Mishnah might have said that we would take precedence in saving the life of a man over the life of a woman. What possible reason might there be a reason to give preference? Well, let's try the opposite end. Maybe we can make it easier at the other side, right? We take women get precedence with regards to clothing. This doesn't mean that we buy them nice clothing. This means if you have two people in front of you, both of whom don't have enough clothing, their clothes are in rags, or they're absolutely naked, or the winter is coming and they don't have clothing, and I've only got one cloak, I give it to the woman. Or if I hear that there are two Jewish people who have been captured by pirates, one is a woman and one is a man, and I've only got enough money to pay a ransom for one, I ransom the woman. What would be the reasons for those two?
Well, for the woman, a naked woman is really much worse. A man can run around naked and nobody cares that much.
Can
But
I?
she's naked. I mean, she could be raped. She could be, I mean, this is a very dangerous
Right.
situation.
The vulnerability to a naked woman is
Vulnerability.
greater because of the imbalance of power and violence that was inherent in the society at the time, and to be honest, still at this time, right? A woman walking through the mall in a bikini is going to face a lot more trouble than a man walking through a mall in a Speedo.
Yeah.
Maybe same proportion of body covered, but that woman is going to be harassed and followed and catcalled and all sorts of other things. Whereas the man, people are just going to say,
Yeah.
put some clothes on, but they doesn't really have to worry about being assaulted from doing so. We may say ideally that in a perfect world, a person should be able to walk down the street naked, not that we should encourage that, without fear of attack, assault, or abuse. But we know in all honesty that it's not, and therefore we protect the person who's more vulnerable, is what the Mishnah is saying there. So too for captivity, right? If you have two people who are in captivity, one is a man, one is a woman, the man, they may not feed well, they may whip him, they may treat him badly, and they may do the same for the woman, but the woman has the added risk of sexual assault while she's in captivity. And therefore shortening her captivity helps protect her some from the dangers that she faces, that she uniquely faces, that he doesn't.
It's just more vulnerable once again.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is why the second line is a little bit more,
Understandable.
well, that if there's a chance of rape for both of them, right? Imagine that they are captured by pirates that are known to sexually abuse both of their captives, whether they're man or women. Then, because the sexual assault of a man by another man is considered to be more egregious, the man is rescued first. Now, we may disagree with that in the modern world, but certainly in the ancient world, that was the feeling.
So what was the logic behind that? I mean, what was the main reason? And because the men can actually build communities, can actually, I mean, I can see a certain value of
Yes.
men, obviously,
Right.
because they are stronger, they can build.
And they support the family. If a man has lost his kids.
In a power-based,
Right.
in a society where power, especially physical power or property power, is the true measure of one's ability to make it to the next year, then having the person who owns the property, which was always the man in these times, or having the person with the physical ability
That's
to
right.
generate productivity to a higher degree was the better option for who you rescue, right?
I mean, it makes sense if you have a
Yes.
society, then
Right.
you would, it makes sense, you know, once you, it's kind of hurtful to a woman because obviously they're in the second class, but at the same time, if I'm a king, I totally understand why I would be making those decisions.
Right,
you
so
know,
it-
you can sustain the
Yeah.
society.
Think there are two boats that are sinking and you are the king and you are in the middle of a war. One boat is sinking with the women and children on it, and the other boat that is sinking with your army on it. And you're the king. Which boat do you save in the middle of your war? Right? You're going to save your army, because if you save the women, they're still going to be attacked and destroyed by the other people's army. If you save the army, at least you got a chance, right? There's an option here. Now, what is underlying all of this is the fact that the societies that our ancestors were forced to live in were inherently unbalanced and favored might as a form of power. Something which, by the way, that I wrote a little bit about for the February Bulletin article, so you can read my longer words on that topic there. But what they were reflecting on was the inherently unequal structure of their society, which forced these decisions to be made in this calculation. If you change the underlying structure of the society, you allow women to own property, you allow women to have their own source of incomes, you no longer favor strength as your form of power, all of a sudden, the calculations change. Right? You enter new numbers in the spreadsheet, and all the totals change in terms of how you're doing your logic of who is more, in quote, valuable or savable, or who is more vulnerable in different situations. And that then becomes a room for a new calculus. So when we say this is not applicable today, it's not that it's not applicable because we're uncomfortable with it. It's not applicable because we have changed the rules by which the society operates, so that we don't have to resort to these types of calculations. And instead, we're left with more complicated calculations of this group of 10 people and that group of 10 people, who do we save? It's a much harder discussion, because we can't just say men, women, old, young, and do a shorthand. We have to make difficult decisions, which is one of the great things about living in a democratic society, when we have to figure out how do we spend the money our government has. Do we help preschoolers? Do we help university students? Do we help the elderly? Do we help soldiers? Do we help the sick? We can't rely on this because we're not dealing with a hard structured power society where obviously the soldiers are the most important thing and everyone else is secondary, because as long as we have enough soldiers, or at least nuclear weapons, we can actually be pretty confident that we're not going to be invaded and taken over in the next year, And that means we free up resources that can be used to help others. And now we actually get to sit and argue with each other and vote on what we're going to do rather than just saying it's obvious, because it's no longer obvious. Thank God, because that means our society has progressed. Okay, 3:8.
A priest takes precedence over a Levite over an Israelite.
Welcome to the first 3 aliyot on Saturday morning,
That's right.
or on a weekday, right? You have the Kohen, you have the Levite, and then you have the rest of us. And that was just the status within the community.
An Israelite over a mamzer.
Right? Remember, a mamzer was somebody that was born to a forbidden union, so adultery, incest, that kind of thing.
A mamzer over a natin.
The natin were the Gibeonites, who were descended from those that had made a kind of trick pact, treaty with Joshua. The citation's at the bottom if you want to look up the story. It's very interesting. They basically fool him into making a pact with them, even though they were Canaanites. And he's like, well, you're all right. Not when he found out who they really were. But you're not going to have full equal status because we made an agreement not to kill you, we won't kill you. So it was kind of a very odd treaty that ends up happening there.
And then a natin takes precedence over a convert. And a convert takes precedence over a freed slave.
Right. So when?
When is this so? When all of these were in other respects equal.
All right. So lest you think we're talking only about the times when, a Kohen was always going to outrank a regular Israelite. That's only if we have no other way to judge the quality of that person. But
if the mamzer was a scholar and the high priest an ignoramus, the scholar mamzer takes precedence over the ignorant high priest.
Oh, wow.
That is
which is a beautiful line to finish on. Which
yes,
is
it is.
yes, and it's perfect, as by the way, for coming at the end of Horayot. Because remember, what is Horayot based on? What is the whole premise of bringing these special sacrifices? Remember, why are we bringing these sacrifices throughout this whole book of Mishnah?
My mistake.
Because they made a mistake, because he was an idiot.
Oh.
Right?
All idiots.
We're saying the high priest could be an idiot, the court could be an idiot, the king could be an idiot, right? It's not always because of idiocy. There are other reasons why you might make a mistake. Mistaken information, you've transposed 2 words in your mind when you were remembering the halacha. I mean, there's lots of reasons, but I don't think it was coincidental that at the end of Horayot, the rabbis wanted to remind us that a smart person, a person who knows Torah and who is of exceptional quality, takes status and precedence over anyone who was simply born into a position. That, yes, we respect the line of the Kohanim.
That's fantastic.
Well, we respect them, and we respect the Levites, and we respect the Israelites, and the whole hierarchy that there is. But we respect most is how well you understand Torah and how well you live that in your life. That is what ultimately takes priority, which is why when it comes back to that whole question of ransoming captives, for example, a Torah scholar was always at the top of the list of who would be ransomed. That was why it was often dangerous during the Middle Ages for Torah scholars to travel, because if they would often get deliberately targeted for being kidnapped because they knew that the towns would pay a high ransom to get them back. There's a whole long discussion in other parts of Jewish law about at what point do you stop paying ransoms, because paying the ransom only encourages people to kidnap more. And that's a whole nother discussion. But I do want to leave on that note here that ultimately what is the measure of a person's worth is their knowledge, their wisdom, their understanding of God and Torah. And by the way, that is the great equalizer, because that is available to everyone. Right? We don't get to choose how we were born, as I sort of was talking to Rachel at her bat mitzvah. Right? We were born against our will. But what we do with our life, that is entirely in our hands. And how much we learn, how much we know, how much we do, that is up to us. And that's kind of our job. And the status, we may have been born with an unequal status, but everything after that point, that's us. Good?
Yeah.
All right. So, Yoma next time.
Thank you, Rabbi. That was a great one.
All right.
I didn't even pick that ending. That's just the one that comes.